Dr. Lena Harrow had spent most of her life searching for things other people believed were long lost or never existed at all. She had walked across deserts, climbed through caves, and brushed dust off stones that had not seen daylight for thousands of years. But nothing in her long career compared to what she discovered during her research trip in the Atacama Desert. The Atacama was one of the driest places on Earth, with cracked soil that stretched for miles and a strange silence that felt almost too heavy. Most people found the desert lonely, but Lena found comfort in its stillness. She felt the land always held stories, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. Her team had been studying a minor archaeological site that local maps barely mentioned. It was supposed to be a quick project, just a few weeks of surface scanning and cataloging small artifacts. But on the 12th day, something unusual happened. A graduate student named Tomas noticed a section of ground where his equipment kept failing. The ground looked the same as everything around it, but his scanner flickered and shut off every time he passed over that spot. At first, the team laughed it off as cheap equipment or a drained battery. But when 3 different devices failed in the exact same area, no one was laughing anymore. Lena decided they should dig there, even though the spot showed no obvious signs of buried structures. The soil was incredibly hard, almost like packed cement. It took hours just to break through the first layer. The sun moved slowly across the sky as the team scraped, dusted, and cleared away dirt bit by bit. Lena kept kneeling beside them, her hands covered in earth, watching every inch of progress. She felt something in her chest she hadn't felt in years, a quiet excitement that told her they were close to something important. Late in the afternoon, as shadows grew long and the wind cooled, someone's tool struck something solid. Everyone froze for a moment, unsure if they imagined it. The sound came again, clear, sharp, unmistakable, metal hitting metal, or at least something that sounded like metal, but that didn't make sense. There were no known civilizations in this region that used metal in large structures. The team brushed the soil away more carefully now. Slowly, a flat, dark surface appeared beneath the dirt. It wasn't stone, its texture felt smoother, almost like polished glass mixed with metal. Lena touched the surface gently. It was cool, even though it had been buried under the hot desert sand. That alone seemed strange. Over the next few hours, they uncovered a structure that looked like the top edge of a huge rectangular object. It was far too large to be a simple artifact. The surface shimmered slightly when the light hit it, giving off a faint blue reflection, even though the sky had already begun turning gold with sunset. Lena felt a tiny chill run down her back, not from fear, but from a sense that the past was reaching out to her in a way she had never experienced before. As darkness settled, the team set up lights around the site. The glow from the lamps made the monolith's surface shine in soft colors, like light moving across water. They wanted to keep digging through the night, but their equipment suddenly began acting strange. Batteries drained in minutes. Laptops shut down while still plugged in. Even their radios gave out short bursts of static. It seemed as if something about the object didn't want too much attention all at once. The next morning, digging continued. With every layer of earth removed, more of the monolith appeared. By mid-afternoon, they had revealed nearly the entire front face. It stood over 3 meters tall, and though it was partially buried at an angle, its shape was too perfect to be natural. There were no cracks, no chips, no signs of aging, and no rust. Lena kept thinking how odd it was that something so large could remain hidden for so long without locals ever mentioning it. Then came the moment that changed everything. Dots as Lena brushed dirt from the center of the monolith. She uncovered markings, delicate lines carved so precisely that they looked more like laser etchings and ancient carvings. The symbols didn't match anything she recognized. They were curved and angled in patterns that almost felt intentional, like a mix of early human writing and something mathematical. There were repeating shapes, spiraling shapes and clusters, that reminded her of star charts she had seen in observatories. Thomas stepped closer and whispered, "This doesn't look human." Lena didn't respond right away. She didn't want to jump to wild ideas, but she also couldn't deny what her eyes were telling her. These carvings were unlike any she had studied, and she had studied hundreds. Her heart beat faster, though she stayed calm on the outside. She always tried to think scientifically, but in that moment she couldn't help but feel the desert air shift around them, as if the world itself had changed slightly. Local workers who had been helping with the dig stood at a distance now. Even though no one said anything, Lena could feel their discomfort. One older guide refused to step near the monolith at all. He said his grandfather once spoke of places in the desert that were not meant to be found. At first, Lena thought he was joking, but the seriousness in his eyes said otherwise. He insisted something about the object felt wrong, not dangerous, but wrong in a way that made him uneasy. Animals around the area also behaved strangely. Birds avoided flying above the dig site, circling widely around it instead. Small desert foxes that usually wandered nearby were nowhere to be seen. Even the insects seemed quieter. It was as if nature itself sensed something different about the monolith. As the team continued cleaning the symbols, Lena noticed the carvings were arranged in vertical lines, much like paragraphs. Some lines had repeating patterns, almost like punctuation. She took detailed photographs, though she worried the files might corrupt because her camera glitched every time she pointed it at the surface. She eventually switched to manual sketches just to be safe. The team held a small meeting that evening, sitting around a table with their notes and sketches. Everyone shared what they felt, what they observed, and what they assumed the discovery could be. Some thought it might be the creation of an ancient culture that had been overlooked by historians. Others believed it might be a ceremonial object with unknown purpose. A few whispered theories about visitors from the sky, not as a joke, but as a possibility they were afraid to even consider. Lena listened to every thought but kept her own feelings quiet. Inside, she was wrestling with curiosity and caution. She didn't want to make claims without proof, but she also sensed that the monolith was far older and far stranger than anything recorded in human history. That night, she walked alone to the dig site. The moonlight reflected off the monolith, making it glow softly in the darkness. She placed her hand gently on its surface again. It felt almost alive in the way it held the cold, as if it had its own memory of time. As she stood there, she realized something simple but powerful. Whatever this object was, it wasn't just a discovery. It was a message. Someone or something had carved these symbols with a purpose. They had left it buried in a desert where it could remain untouched for ages. And now, after countless lifetimes, it had finally found an audience. Lena felt a quiet promise form in her heart. She would uncover the meaning of the symbols, no matter how long it took. She would listen to the story the monolith wanted to tell. She didn't know yet that the message carved into its surface was a warning, one meant for the present, not the past. But she could already feel that this discovery was only the beginning of something much larger. Something that would challenge everything she believed about human history. And with that thought, she turned back toward camp, unaware that the world she knew was about to change forever. After the discovery of the monolith, Dr. Lena Harrow knew that the next step was to understand what the carvings actually meant. The desert had given them a clue, but the clue was written in a language that no one had seen before. Lena carefully packed photographs, sketches, and even tiny fragments of the dust that had clung to the surface of the monolith. Everything was sent to laboratories and experts around the world. But the most important person she contacted was Dr. Paolo Mir, a linguist known for solving ancient languages that had puzzled scholars for decades. Paolo received the digital scans with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Most of the scans he got in a week were routine, broken tablet inscriptions with already known symbols, but this one was different. From the first moment he opened the files, he felt a strange familiarity. It was as if the symbols were somehow designed to be read by modern minds, even though they clearly belonged to an unknown time. Paolo worked day and night, drawing the symbols, comparing them with thousands of ancient scripts, and trying to find patterns that could make sense. By the third day, he had noticed something astonishing. Some of the symbols appeared to follow a logical pattern, almost like mathematical formulas. Others seemed to represent stars, planets, or something in the sky. It was as though the author of the message wanted to communicate not just ideas, but also calculations. Paolo could not explain why the brain of a modern linguist felt naturally drawn to these patterns, but he could not deny the connection. Meanwhile, Lena received messages from her colleagues at the desert site. Strange things continued to happen. Instruments that had once worked fine now showed inconsistent readings. Even the weather acted oddly. Winds that were supposed to be gentle became sudden gusts, and temperatures dropped unexpectedly at night. The local guides grew more nervous, whispering about old desert legends of objects left by the sky that should never be disturbed. Lena tried to stay focused on science, but even she could not ignore the feeling that the monolith was alive in a sense. Not with life as humans know it, but with purpose. Paolo began piecing together the first fragments of the translation. At first the meaning seemed unclear. Words appeared to describe travelers from above and watchers of the land. Then, as he studied more, he noticed repeated warnings. One phrase appeared again and again, translated roughly as, "Beware the rise of the children of the blue planet." Paolo stared at the screen, unsure if the translation was accurate. He double-checked it, triple-checked it, and even asked a colleague in another country to verify it. Every time, the same words appeared. Paolo sent an encrypted message to Lena, urging her to come to his lab. When she arrived, she saw him pacing nervously, surrounded by stacks of printouts, sketches, and tablets. "Lena," he said, "this is unlike anything I have ever seen. I've translated parts of the message. It is not only a history, it is a warning. But it is not for people in the past. It is for us, for the future." Lena listened carefully as Paolo explained his findings. The monolith described a group of intelligent beings who had visited Earth long ago. These visitors observed humans and other creatures, taking notes on their behavior, their growth, and their ability to change the world around them. The warning, Paolo said, was simple but shocking. Humans were seen as a species that could be dangerous to themselves and possibly to others. The carvings used words like destructive potential, rapid growth, and uncontrolled progress. Lena felt a chill. The words were scientific, not emotional. But the message was unmistakable. Humans were the main focus, and they were considered unpredictable. As they worked, Lena began noticing connections between the monolith and other strange occurrences around the world. Stories of ancient civilizations collapsing suddenly, unexplained technological advancements appearing without clear origins, and myths about watchers from the sky now seemed linked. Paolo confirmed this. The monolith mentioned that the visitors had been observing patterns of development and warning future observers about the species that could rise too fast and change the balance of the world. The more they read, the more unnerving it became. The carvings seemed to suggest that humans were not the first intelligent beings to reach this stage, yet they were seen as potentially unique in their ability to learn, adapt, and even dominate the environment. Paolo described it as if the monolith contained a field report written by an outside intelligence note meant to alert others about a species capable of surprising anyone, even those who had once visited Earth. Lena tried to stay calm. She was a scientist and believed in evidence, but the evidence in front of her was difficult to explain. Metallurgical tests on the monolith showed alloys that could not have been produced by any known civilization of the era the carvings were assumed to be from. Carbon dating produced conflicting results, suggesting impossible time. The monolith had been buried for thousands of years, yet its materials seemed almost modern. How could such an object exist? They continued working for days without sleep, translating line by line. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The monolith was divided into sections: observations of humans, descriptions of the sky travelers, warnings, and finally, a record of predictions. The predictions were not specific events like battles or disasters, they were about human behavior in general. The carvings seemed to say that humans were capable of great creativity and cooperation, but also great mistakes and self-inflicted damage. It was as if the visitors had studied the species carefully, understanding both its strengths and weaknesses. Paolo was particularly struck by a recurring symbol he called the observer mark. It appeared every time the text discussed the visitors' warnings about humans. He theorized that the visitors had designed the monolith so that anyone who reached this stage of translation would understand the seriousness of the message. In other words, it was meant for someone like them, a human capable of recognizing patterns, interpreting information, and acting on it. Lena shivered. The realization was clear. They were exactly the audience the monolith had been waiting for. News about the discovery began to spread quietly. Other archaeologists, government officials, and media outlets expressed interest, but most were kept away from the actual site or the full translations. Lena and Paolo became aware that their work was not only scientific but also sensitive. They were holding something that could change the way humanity understood its own history. Some experts doubted the authenticity of the monolith, calling it a hoax, while others warned Lena privately that similar artifacts had been found in other locations and quietly removed by authorities. No one wanted the public to panic, and for now, Lena understood why. Even as they decoded more of the message, strange things continued to happen. Paolo's computer screen sometimes flickered with unexplainable patterns. Lena's camera occasionally captured images that seemed blurred, even when she used manual focus. The desert itself seemed to have a presence, as if it were aware that the monolith had been uncovered. Lena tried to remind herself to stay rational. There was no evidence of magic, no sign of supernatural forces. Yet she could not deny that something about the monolith affected her mind in subtle ways, heightened curiosity, fleeting visions of strange shapes in her dreams, and an intense desire to solve the mystery. One night, as they sat together in Paolo's lab, the final translation of a section became clear. It read, in simple words, "The children of Earth hold a future unknown. Their greatest threat is themselves. Observe them closely, for their rise may surprise even the stars." Lena and Paolo stared at the words in silence. They were not just a warning, they were a prediction. Someone or something had recognized humans as a species that could change everything. It was a message about responsibility, growth, and the unpredictable nature of humanity. By the end of the week, Lena returned to the desert with Paolo. Together, they documented every inch of the monolith, recording the light, temperature, and sounds around it. Local guides continued to avoid the area, and even the desert animals behaved as if they knew the site was special. Lena realized that the monolith was more than an object. It was a bridge between the past, the present, and the future. It was a reminder that humans, despite their intelligence, were not fully understood by even the most advanced observers. Lena and Paolo left the desert with a promise to study, to translate, and to understand. But both knew that the monolith had already changed them. It had opened a door into a story that was larger than human history, larger than any one civilization, and larger than anything they could fully comprehend. And as they flew over the desert, watching the monolith disappear below, Lena whispered to herself, almost like a vow, "We will uncover the truth, no matter where it leads." Unbeknownst to them, the monolith's message had already reached beyond their understanding. It was not just a warning, it was a challenge, and the true story of humans, their potential, their choices, and their rise was only just beginning to unfold. After weeks of careful study, Dr. Lena Harrow began noticing something she hadn't expected. The monolith in the Atacama Desert seemed to connect not only to its immediate surroundings but also to human history itself. Every culture she studied had stories, myths, or legends that somehow echoed the warnings carved into the stone. Tales of strange visitors from the sky, sudden leaps in knowledge, and civilizations collapsing without clear reasons now seemed to form a pattern. It was as if the monolith had left breadcrumbs for anyone patient enough to follow them. Lena spent long hours in her office, spreading maps, photographs, and ancient texts across her desk. Her team of researchers worked alongside her, comparing languages, star charts, and historical records. Every discovery they made seemed to confirm one unsettling idea. Humans had been observed before, not just by other humans but by beings far more advanced. The carvings on the monolith were not random. They were carefully recorded observations, like notes in a scientific journal. And the focus of these notes was always the same: humans. Even the smallest details caught Lena's attention. Ancient drawings of winged figures, supposedly representing gods, often appeared near depictions of humans learning, building, or fighting. Stories of people guided by lights in the sky were repeated across continents and centuries. Sometimes, these stories were dismissed as myths or exaggerations, but Lena, guided by the monolith, began to see them as fragments of a much larger truth. Every story was a piece of the puzzle. Every legend was a reminder of the visitor's warnings. The more she studied, the more patterns emerged. Certain civilizations, like the Sumerians, the Egyptians, and even the ancient people of the Americas, all experienced sudden bursts of knowledge and technological advancement without clear explanation. Great cities appeared almost overnight, only to vanish decades or centuries later. Lena realized that the monolith's carvings were essentially a record of these cycles. The visitors had watched humans rise, learn, and sometimes fail, again and again. And the warning carved into the stone was not about any one event, it was about humanity as a whole. Dr. Paolo Mirek, who had joined her in this stage of the study, was equally fascinated. Paolo spent hours analyzing the star-like symbols on the monolith, noticing that they didn't match the constellations known to humans at the time the stone was supposedly carved. Some of the symbols seemed to describe locations in space, perhaps where the visitors had come from. Others were diagrams that could represent mathematical principles or time cycles. Paolo's translation suggested that the observers were keeping track of human development over centuries, recording behaviors, inventions, and societal changes. One afternoon, as Lena examined an ancient scroll with symbols resembling the monolith's carvings, she noticed something remarkable. The scroll described a society that suddenly vanished, leaving behind mysterious structures and artifacts. According to her research, this society had disappeared around the same time another ancient culture recorded seeing lights in the sky. The timeline matched the monolith's description almost perfectly. Lena felt a mixture of awe and unease. It was as if the monolith had been predicting these events, or at least recording them so carefully that humans themselves had almost followed its warnings without realizing it. The realization struck her like a wave. The monolith was more than a historical artifact. It was a message across time. It was a record of human potential, human mistakes, and human resilience. And it was also a warning. Humans had always been unpredictable, capable of remarkable creativity, but also capable of causing harm to themselves. The visitors who left the monolith had observed this pattern, recognizing both the beauty and danger in humanity. Lena felt a quiet thrill, but also a growing sense of responsibility. She and Paolo were now part of the story. During this stage of research, Lena began noticing subtle, unusual events in her own life. Equipment in her lab occasionally acted strangely, almost as if it were reacting to her presence. Her computer would sometimes freeze, then restart on its own, displaying sequences of symbols that she had not typed. Paolo experienced similar phenomena with his scanner, seeing fleeting flashes of light when certain pages of translation were open. Neither could explain these events scientifically, yet they were undeniable. Lena wondered whether the monolith's presence, or the knowledge it contained, was influencing the world around them in ways they could not yet understand. At the same time, global events seemed to echo the monolith's warnings. News reports detailed unusual climate shifts, new technological breakthroughs, and surprising patterns of human behavior that often had both positive and negative consequences. Lena could not ignore the parallels. She realized that the monolith had not just been warning about the past, it had been anticipating the present. The carvings spoke of humans as a species capable of shaping their environment, advancing rapidly, and sometimes facing challenges they could not yet control. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains near her research lab, Lena and Paolo sat together, reviewing the connections they had discovered. "It's almost as if the visitors were keeping a diary," Paolo said, pointing to the symbols on the monolith. "But not for themselves. It's for anyone who comes after someone who can understand the patterns. And right now, that someone is us." Lena nodded, her mind racing. She understood that the monolith had been designed to survive centuries, hidden in the desert, waiting for humans with the ability to comprehend its message. The translation was revealing another startling detail. The visitors had observed that humans could advance faster than expected, sometimes in ways that even the visitors had not anticipated. They called this rapid development potential and noted that it could be both a gift and a risk. Lena realized that this description fit perfectly with human history. Civilization had advanced through countless innovations, often faster than anyone could fully understand. Wars, inventions, and discoveries had all shaped the world, and humans had repeatedly surprised themselves and others. Yet the monolith's warning was clear. The greatest risk was not from the visitors, but from humans themselves. The carvings repeatedly emphasized self-awareness, responsibility, and observation. It was as if the message was saying, humans have the potential to rise and shape the world, but they must recognize their own power. Lena felt a deep sense of connection with the ancient observers. Their message was not a threat. It was a lesson. It was a call for humans to pay attention to themselves, to learn from history, and to make choices wisely. Over the next few weeks, Lena and Paolo visited several historical sites that matched locations referenced in the monolith. They found traces of unusual construction techniques, strange artifacts, and patterns of knowledge that had been lost to time. Each discovery reinforced their belief that the monolith had been observing humans for centuries, documenting the cycles of growth and caution. It was as if the visitors had been silently guiding humanity, leaving clues for those who were ready to understand. The deeper Lena and Paolo delved, the more they realized that the monolith's message was not just about warning humans, it was about understanding them. The carvings showed respect for human ingenuity, curiosity, and resilience, yet they also carried a gentle caution. Humans were unpredictable, capable of remarkable achievements but also capable of mistakes. The visitors had recognized this duality long before humans had fully understood it themselves. One night, as Lena prepared to leave her lab, she paused to look at a projection of the monolith's carvings. The symbols glowed softly in the darkness, almost as if they were alive. She felt a quiet sense of awe. This was no longer just a scientific discovery. It was a message across time, a connection between past observers and present humans. And she understood, with clarity she could not ignore, that the monolith's true purpose was not to frighten or confuse, but to teach. Lena returned to Paolo's lab the next morning, and together they continued translating the remaining symbols. They discovered sections that described humans in very specific ways: curious, inventive, emotional, social, and often unpredictable. The observers had noticed both individual actions and collective patterns, understanding that humans could create incredible beauty but also face challenges that required wisdom. Each line of translation deepened Lena's respect for the intelligence and foresight of the visitors. That's part 3 drew to a close. Lena realized something profound. The monolith was more than an artifact. It was a record, a guide, and a challenge. Humans were not merely the subject of observation. They were the inheritors of a message that demanded reflection and understanding. And as she stared at the symbols glowing on her screen, she understood that the next part of the story, the rise of humans, their choices, and their potential, was only just beginning to unfold. As weeks turned into months, Dr. Lena Harrow and Dr. Paolo Miric began to feel the weight of their discoveries. The monolith was no longer just an object of curiosity. It had become a window into a reality far larger than anything they had ever imagined. Every symbol they translated seemed to lead to new questions, and every answer only deepened the mystery. The more they learned, the more it became clear that the monolith had not been made for the past. It was meant for the present. And the present, they realized, was the time humans had reached the stage described in its warnings. The carvings were no longer abstract or cryptic. Paolo had completed much of the translation, and a consistent theme emerged. Humans were not the subject of a threat from some alien species, but rather the observer's concern was that humans themselves were unpredictable, powerful, and capable of affecting much more than they realized. The monolith described humanity in ways that were both accurate and unsettling. Humans were curious, inventive, social, and capable of learning at remarkable speeds, but they were also reckless, sometimes short-sighted, and able to make choices with consequences they could not yet understand. Lena felt a chill every time she read those lines. The monolith seemed to know them, the humans of today, better than anyone else ever could. At first, Lena tried to focus purely on the historical side of the research. She mapped the monolith's references to past civilizations, looking at how each had risen and fallen, often in sudden and mysterious ways. She saw parallels between the ancient societies and the modern world. Sudden technological advances, social change, and environmental challenges all echoed patterns the monolith had noted centuries before. Paolo pointed out that the carvings were careful to record both progress and mistakes, suggesting that the visitors had been observing not only the achievements but also the potential failures of humanity. The more they translated, the more disturbing the implications became. The monolith included predictions, or perhaps observations, about how humans could develop in ways that might even surpass the visitors' expectations. It described humans as a species that grows fast, learns quickly, and changes the world with their choices. Lena paused as she read the words. The monolith was not warning about destruction from the outside. It was warning about humanity's own capabilities. Humans were being recognized as unique, not just on Earth but in a larger cosmic sense. Strangely, the monolith did not convey this as a threat in the conventional sense. There was no fear, no anger, no sense of aggression. Instead, there was precision, clarity, and observation. The visitors who had left the monolith seemed to admire humans even as they warned about their potential. They saw creativity, intelligence, and curiosity, but also unpredictability. Lena understood that the monolith was almost like a scientific report combined with a message of guidance. It did not tell humans what to do, but it reminded them that their choices mattered on a scale that extended beyond their immediate lives. Lena and Paolo continued to cross-reference the monolith with historical patterns. They noticed that many civilizations had experienced sudden periods of growth followed by unexpected decline. Technology and knowledge sometimes appeared earlier than expected or vanished without explanation. Legends of beings descending from the sky, teaching humans or leaving objects of knowledge were common across many regions. Paolo suggested that the monolith was documenting these patterns, almost as if the visitors had been conducting long-term observations and keeping a record of the species' development. The deeper Lena and Paolo delved, the more their perspective shifted. The monolith was not just about history, it was about responsibility. The carvings repeatedly emphasized that humans had power over their environment, their societies, and their future. But power came with the potential for mistakes, and the visitors' notes indicated that humans could surprise even those who observed them. Lena felt a strange mixture of awe and fear. Humans were remarkable, yes, but their potential for unintended consequences was enormous. One afternoon, Lena received a message from a retired intelligence officer who had followed the discovery from the beginning. The officer suggested that similar monoliths had been found in other regions but were quietly removed and stored in secure facilities. Governments had apparently been aware of artifacts like this for decades, but most of the information had been classified. Lena felt a sudden weight settle over her. The monolith was not just a scientific curiosity, it was a matter of global significance. Yet no one outside a small circle of researchers was allowed to know its contents. Despite this, Lena and Paolo continued their work. They spent long hours translating, mapping, and analyzing. One evening, Paolo pointed to a section of symbols that had puzzled them for weeks. "This," he said slowly, "is the part that makes everything clear." The visitors were not warning about aliens coming to attack. They were documenting humans because humans themselves could become a force beyond anyone's control even theirs. Lena read the translation carefully. The words confirmed her growing sense that the monolith was a warning, but not in the way she had first imagined. It was not about external threats. It was about self. Humans had the power to rise, to innovate, and to influence not only their own planet but potentially the wider world, perhaps even the stars. The monolith urged careful observation, understanding, and reflection. The visitors had identified a species capable of exceeding expectations, and they had left a record so that future observers, humans themselves, would recognize the significance of their actions. As the days passed, Lena began to notice subtle changes in how she viewed her surroundings. Reading the monolith's words made her hyper-aware of patterns in human behavior, in society, and in nature. Small events that might have seemed ordinary before now carried significance. Human innovation, cultural shifts, environmental changes all seemed to connect back to the message carved in stone. It was as if the monolith had taught her a new way of seeing the world. News from around the globe also seemed to echo the monolith's insights. Sudden advancements in technology, unexpected environmental shifts, and surprising social movements seemed to follow patterns that the visitors had noted centuries ago. Lena realized that the monolith was not just a relic, it was a mirror, showing humanity who they were, what they were capable of, and what they might become. The more she studied, the clearer it became that the message was not finished. Humans were still writing the story, and the choices they made next were part of the very warning the monolith had preserved. One night, as Lena and Paolo worked late, they uncovered a final section of the translation that changed everything. The words were simple but powerful. "Fear not, the visitors of the stars. Fear the day when humans ascend to meet them." Lena felt a chill as she read aloud. It was not a threat. It was a statement, a recognition of human potential. The monolith had been left not to frighten but to prepare. Humans had the ability to rise, to achieve, to learn, and to face challenges that even the visitors themselves could not predict. Lena leaned back in her chair and looked at Paolo. "They were watching us," she said quietly, "and they understood us better than we understand ourselves." Paolo nodded, his expression a mixture of wonder and awe. "They didn't want to control us," he replied. "They wanted us to understand the responsibility that comes with being powerful." The discovery shifted their perspective completely. The monolith was not just a historical artifact, it was a guide, a record, and a reflection. Humans had been observed, documented, and studied, but the final message was always about choice. Humanity had the potential to rise, to innovate, and to influence the future. The visitors' notes were a warning, yes, but also a call to awareness, understanding, and careful action. As part 4 drew to a close, Lena realized that the monolith had prepared them for something much larger. It had shown that humans were remarkable, but also fragile in ways that only careful observation could reveal. It had urged patience, reflection, and responsibility, and it had made one thing clear: The story of humans was only beginning, and the next chapters would depend on the choices they made now. By the time Dr. Lena Harrow and Dr. Paulo Mirek reached the final sections of the monolith's carvings, they both felt an unusual mixture of excitement and weight. It was not the excitement of discovery alone, nor the burden of responsibility alone. It was both. The monolith had revealed itself to be a record, a warning, and a guide. It was a mirror reflecting the human story, showing both its potential and its risks. But now, in its final passages, it became clear that the visitors who had created it were leaving more than history. They were leaving a challenge. The last part of the translation spoke directly about humans in the present and future. Unlike previous sections, which described cycles of civilizations and patterns of growth, this section focused on the species as a whole. The visitors emphasized humanity's uniqueness, describing it as a species capable of rapid development, remarkable creativity, and unpredictable choices. The carvings repeatedly stated that humans had the power to shape the world in the future in ways that even the visitors themselves could not fully anticipate. Lena felt a shiver of awe. This was no ordinary artifact. It was a statement about the very nature of humanity. Paulo read aloud the words as they carefully traced each symbol. The children of Earth are capable of rising beyond expectation. They can build, they can learn, they can change the balance of their world. Their greatest strength is their curiosity. Their greatest challenge is themselves. Watch them closely, for their actions may reach beyond what you can foresee. Lena sat in silence, letting the words sink in. For centuries, these messages had waited for humans to understand them. Now, the humans were the audience, and the visitors were no longer merely observers. They were leaving the responsibility to humanity itself. The implication was clear. Humans were no longer just a species under observation. The monolith suggested that humanity had reached a point where its choices mattered not only to Earth but potentially to the wider universe. The visitors had recognized something fundamental. Humans had the ability to rise, to innovate, and to create, but also to make mistakes that could have far-reaching consequences. The carvings were a warning, but not one meant to instill fear. They were a call for awareness, reflection, and careful action. Lena felt the weight of this responsibility. She thought of the modern world, rapid technological advancements, climate change, exploration of space, and the increasing connectivity of human society. The monolith seemed to anticipate all of these developments, observing patterns that humanity was only beginning to recognize in itself. The visitors had left this record not to control humans, but to guide them, to show the possibilities of what humans could achieve if they understood themselves fully. As they continued studying, Lena and Paulo noticed subtle patterns in the monolith's carvings that suggested a deeper connection between observation and guidance. The visitors had not only recorded events and behaviors, they had left instructions of sorts, embedded in symbols and sequences. The instructions were not literal commands, but hints, ways to interpret the cycles of growth and collapse, ways to recognize human potential and limitations, ways to predict outcomes without forcing them. It was as if the visitors had created a tool for understanding humanity itself, one that could be used by humans who were ready to see clearly. Outside the lab, the world continued in its usual pace. Technology advanced, societies changed, and the climate shifted in small but noticeable ways. Lena noticed parallels between the monolith's messages and the news from around the globe. Sudden scientific breakthroughs mirrored the monolith's references to rapid learning. Social movements and innovations echoed the patterns of growth observed centuries ago. And yet, the monolith's warning remained consistent. Humans could be unpredictable, and their actions had consequences that reached far beyond immediate understanding. One evening, Lena and Paulo returned to the desert site for the first time since the monolith had been transported to their lab for study. Standing beside the massive stone once more, Lena traced her fingers over the smooth surface. She could feel the intention behind every carving, every symbol. It was almost as if the monolith itself were alive, not in a literal sense, but in its capacity to speak across time, to connect past, present, and future. Paulo stood beside her, silent, sensing the same presence. They spent hours in quiet reflection. The desert was calm, yet it carried a sense of purpose. Lena realized that the monolith had not just been observing humans, it had been preparing them. Its warnings were not meant to limit humanity but to inspire thoughtfulness, reflection, and growth. Humans were capable of achieving incredible things, but only if they recognized the weight of their choices. Every invention, every discovery, and every social decision mattered. The monolith had made this abundantly clear. The final lines of the monolith became their focus. Fear not the visitors of the stars. Fear the day when humans ascend to meet them. Lena read the words aloud, and Paulo repeated them quietly. The meaning was powerful. Humans were no longer passive. They had the potential to rise to a level that even those who had observed them could not fully anticipate. The visitors had left a warning not about alien forces, but about humanity itself. The challenge was for humans to recognize their own abilities, to act responsibly, and to understand the impact of their choices on the world and perhaps beyond. Lena realized that the monolith had been a silent guide for centuries, waiting for humans capable of understanding its message. It had been patient, precise, and purposeful. And now, it had chosen its audience. Humans had reached the point where their actions could influence not only their own future, but potentially the future of the planet, society, and the greater universe. The responsibility was both inspiring and intimidating. Paolo looked at Lena and said, "They trusted us to see this. They trusted us to understand ourselves." Lena nodded. The truth of his words resonated deeply. The monolith had not been written to frighten, confuse, or control. It had been written to awaken humans to their own potential. Its creators understood human nature, with all its strengths and flaws. The carvings were a reminder that power and creativity carried responsibility, and that the future depended on careful observation, understanding, and action. Returning from the desert, Lena and Paolo began planning how to preserve the monolith and its message for future generations. They realized that the information contained within it was too important to remain hidden, yet also too delicate to be shared carelessly. The world was not ready for the full truth of its message, but the knowledge had already changed them. They had seen humanity through the lens of centuries of observation, and they now understood the significance of every choice people made. As the days passed, Lena found herself reflecting more on the meaning of the monolith. It was not just an artifact or a relic. It was a teacher, a record, and a challenge. It encouraged humans to observe themselves, to learn from history, and to consider the consequences of their actions. The monolith had made one thing abundantly clear. Humans were extraordinary, capable of great achievements but also capable of errors. The future would be shaped by how well they understood themselves and the world around them in the quiet of her lab. Lena wrote a note to Paolo. "We have been given a responsibility, not to control, not to predict, but to understand and to guide ourselves. The monolith's message is ours to live, not just to study." Paolo nodded when he read it, understanding the weight of the statement. Together, they realized that the monolith was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter for humanity, one that depended on awareness, care, and insight. And so, as Part 5 draws to a close, Lena and Paolo continued their work, aware that humanity was standing at a threshold. The monolith had revealed the potential, the responsibility, and the challenge of their species. Humans could rise, achieve, and create wonders beyond imagination, but only if they understood themselves and the weight of their choices. The visitors who had carved the message long ago had left it for a reason, and now it was in human hands to meet that challenge. The monolith had done its part. Now it was time for humans to do theirs.